Chapter 1. The Scorpion's Shadow. In the heart of Nehekhara, where the sun bore down like an unrelenting god, and the wind sang only dirges of dust and bone, stood the once glorious city of Ka-Sekhet. Time had hollowed its streets and withered its gardens, yet its majesty remained, carved into the bleached stone of its towering ziggurats and gold-veined statues. Now a city of the dead, it pulsed with necromantic life, an eternal empire where kings never truly perished, and the line between servitude and sovereignty was preserved by rituals older than memory. At the pinnacle of the ivory terrace, within the mortuary citadel of black sand, Prince Akhmen-hotep stood motionless as the dawn bled across the horizon. His golden funerary mask, engraved with serpents and sunbursts, caught the first light of day. Below, endless ranks of skeletal legionnaires stood in their niches, unmoving, arms crossed over chests, guardians of an empire that no longer breathed. He did not feel the sunrise, not the warmth, not the winds. Such sensations were now as distant as the mortal heartbeat he'd lost centuries ago. The rituals of preservation had left his body hard and hollow, a husk of divine craftsmanship wrapped in ancient linens and sealed in enchantments. Yet his mind, his will, burned hotter than ever. For he was not a king. Not yet. The eternal rule of his father, Leech King Sutekh-Ramun, cast a shadow longer than the obelisks of Petra. First of his line, anointed by the high priests of Khemri, Sutekh-Ramun had conquered death, ruled Ka-Sekhet with the weight of millennia, and silenced all dissent. Akhmen-hotep, second-born and forever bound to servitude, had served faithfully for 5 lifetimes, leading campaigns in the name of his father, scribing rituals of resurrection, and tending to the endless upkeep of tomb temples and burial vaults. But obedience had soured into resentment. For every conquest he led, it was his father's name that echoed through the halls of praise. For every temple built, it was Sutekh-Ramun's face etched into the walls, not his. His dreams, fevered and persistent even in undeath, were filled with visions of golden thrones and serpents coiled around crowns, whispering, "Take what is yours." The scorpions of the deep desert had no kings, only those bold enough to strike first. And so, in the days when Morrisleep hung full and sickly in the sky, and the sands blew westward toward cursed Numas, Akhmen-hotep began to walk a forbidden path. The black pyramid of Shalakura, long abandoned and buried in half-truths, lay in the valley of the Scorpion's Tongue, a place so cursed even carrion birds dared not fly overhead. Once a temple to the god of secrets, it had collapsed under the weight of its own blasphemies. Now it stood shattered, a jagged ruin swallowed by dunes, haunted by whispers and warded by ancient death glyphs. Akhmen-hotep traveled there in silence, accompanied by a retinue of mute ushabti carved from obsidian, their hulking forms trudging without pause. The desert shifted underfoot, treacherous and changing, but he moved with the certainty of one born to the sands. The air grew colder with each step, though the sun blazed above. Even the wind dared not howl here, it slithered. The pyramid revealed itself like a wound in the earth. Blackened stone jutted from the sands like the bones of a dying god, and the runes etched upon them pulsed with faint blue fire. Akhmen-hotep descended into the ruin, his staff of command glowing faintly, illuminating passages choked with dust and time. Deep beneath the ruin, in a vaulted chamber sealed for over 1,000 years, he found it. A sarcophagus, not of stone, but of obsidian and brass, shaped like a serpent coiled around a heart. Before it, the remains of priests lay crumbled, their bones blackened as if charred from within. Warding glyphs pulsed as his presence disturbed the long silence. On the walls, forbidden carvings depicted a ritual older than even Setra's reign, a prince stealing not merely power, but the soul seat of his father. It was blasphemy of the highest order, an affront to the gods of Nehekhara, especially Jaf and Osirian. But it promised what Akhmen-hotep desired above all, eternal sovereignty unbound by ancestry. He pressed his hand to the sarcophagus. Visions erupted behind his eyes. A throne of ash, a crown of bones, the earth split by jackal jaws, and his father, Sutekh-Ramun, screaming in wrath from beyond the veil. But Akhmen-hotep did not flinch. He whispered the first syllables of a long-forgotten incantation, one that would take weeks to complete. The winds of Shaish stirred, and from the corners of the chamber golden scorpions crawled forth, their eyes glowing with unnatural flame. They circled him, not to strike, but to witness. In the darkness of that profane place, Akhmen-hotep began to cast the first shadow of his rebellion. The sands of Ka-Sekhet would soon run red, not with blood, but with broken oaths, shattered spirits, and the dust of kings. Chapter 2. The Sands Whisper Treason. The night in Nehekhara was a cold that knew no mercy. Where the sun once baked the earth until it cracked like ancient pottery, darkness now fell like a burial shroud across the desert. Stars blazed above like the watching eyes of old gods, distant and uncaring, and more Sleeb hung low and bloated on the horizon, its leering green glow bathing the dunes in sickly light. In the heart of Ka-Sekhet, deep within the mortuary citadel, Prince Akhmen-hotep stood alone in the hall of unseen judgments. A vast chamber carved from crimson sandstone, its vaulted ceiling lined with obsidian mirrors that reflected not light, but the lingering shades of the dead. The walls were lined with ossuaries, each bone meticulously placed, each skull inscribed with prayers to Jaf and Osirian. Braziers sputtered with ghostlight, blue-green flames dancing in the silent gloom. He had come here often of late, when dreams began to bleed into waking thought. Dreams of a throne that was not his. Dreams of a city drowning in sand and shadow. Dreams of his father's voice, cold and eternal, saying nothing but no. He stood at the base of the grand altar, the glyphs upon it dormant, the silence oppressive. And then something shifted. The flames dimmed, as though exhaling their last breath. The air thickened, the scent of embalming oils and long-sealed crypts rising like a fog. The very stones of the floor pulsed faintly beneath his feet, as though remembering the tread of something ancient. Then, from the shadows between the pillars, she came. At first she was little more than a silhouette, a thin figure cloaked in layers of black linen, her face obscured by a veil of shadow. Her movements were silent, fluid, like the slow drift of incense smoke. But as she stepped forward, the air around her seemed to recoil, and the torches guttered in silent fear. Akhmen-hotep did not move, though every instinct whispered that this was no mortal being. He could feel it, the pull of her presence, like a riptide through the veil, bending the currents of the winds of death. She stopped a few paces from him, her voice soft and dry, like wind over bone. "You walk with ambition wrapped like linen around a rotting corpse, son of Sutekh." Akhmen-hotep's fingers tightened around the serpent-headed staff he carried, though he made no threatening move. "You name me without introduction," he replied, voice low and steady. "Speak your purpose, shade, or be gone." A faint laugh echoed, not cruel, but ancient, tired. "I am no shade. I am Sayara the Silent, last high priestess of Jaf, god of death and just vengeance. My name has not been spoken in 2,000 years, not even by the worms who gnaw my bones." Her veil lifted slightly, revealing a face not alive, yet not truly dead, mummified flesh drawn tight over noble features, lips sewn shut with golden thread, eyes like pits of starlight flickering with blue fire. Despite himself, Akhmen-hotep stepped back. This was no illusion, no specter conjured by sleepless dreams. Sara was real, and she carried with her the cold majesty of the divine. "Verify, do you seek me?" he asked. The priestess extended a withered hand, palm up. From the center of her palm unfurled a vision. Not a mirage, but a conjuration so vivid it pierced through the gloom like a blade. He saw himself seated upon the throne of black gold, armies arrayed in perfect silence across the endless dunes, obelisks bearing his name towering above every city of the Nehekhara basin. The twin suns of ancient myth burned overhead, and even the gods bowed their heads as his sarcophagus blazed like a second star. He saw his father, Sutekh-Ramun, cast down, his skull shattered, his name struck from every cartouche and mural, his spirit bound in chains forged from the very laws of undeath. The vision faded, and Sarah lowered her hand. "You crave dominion, but you serve. You ache to rule, but kneel at a tomb not your own. The throne will never be yours, not while his sarcophagus still breathes his name into the winds of Shaish." Akhmen-hotep turned away, his jaw tight. "I know the laws. The soul seat is his, the throne is his. Unless it is taken." The words fell like a blade. "You mean to tempt me into patricide?" "No," Sarah said, her sewn lips unmoving. "I mean to offer you justice, as Jaf offers to all. The Lich King's reign was not ordained by gods, but by necromancers and war. He has hoarded power beyond his rightful span. His sarcophagus is a beacon, anchoring his soul, feeding his armies, corrupting the balance. Take it, shatter it, replace it. Only then will your name rise above the desert." Akhmen-hotep's thoughts churned like a maelstrom. He had studied the binding glyphs etched into his father's golden casket, the enchantments that tethered spirit to kingdom, mind to monument. He had read the forbidden scrolls locked beneath the temple of eternal silence. He had known, always known, that the seat of power in Nehekhara was not the throne, but the sarcophagus. It was the heart of the king, the soul anchor, the true crown. To steal it would not be murder, it would be usurpation of essence, a theft of legacy itself. "And if I fail?" he asked, voice hollow. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes burning like twin torches. "Then you will not die, you will not fade, you will wander as dust and regret, screaming through the sands for eternity. But if you succeed, the gods may yet kneel." For a long time, Akhmen-hotep stood in silence. The ancient laws warred against the hunger in his soul, but the hunger was old now, cultivated, honed. It had festered long enough to silence doubt. At last he turned back to Sarah, eyes glowing with something cold and ancient. "Then I will take what is mine?" The priestess bowed, not out of servitude, but recognition. "When Nyx the moon is swallowed by dust, the tomb will sleep lightest. The wards will flicker. The breath between eternities will open. Be ready." And as suddenly as she had come, she vanished, folding into the darkness like a scroll returned to its case. Akhmen-hotep stood alone again in the hall of unseen judgments, but the air did not return to normal. The shadows were longer now, and in the far corners of the hall, where the light dared not go, something had begun to whisper. Chapter 3. The Sarcophagus Unsealed. The night chosen for betrayal came without herald or omen. No star shifted, no god whispered, no sandstorm blotted out the moon. It was an ordinary night in the city of tombs, quiet, eternal, and drenched in deathlight. Yet, beneath that quiet, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Akhmen-hotep stood within the sanctum of golden silence, deep beneath the mortuary citadel. It was a place none dared enter but the Leech King himself, sealed behind walls of black granite and sorcery older than Setra's first breath. The air here did not move. It pressed down upon intruders like the weight of the grave. The faint shimmer of necromantic wards painted the chamber in flickering blue runes that hissed and pulsed like the heartbeat of a slumbering god. At the chamber's center rested the sarcophagus of Sutekh-Ramun, carved from sunstone veined with gold, its every surface etched with prayers, warnings, and names of power. The figure upon its lid, his father, eternal, regal, perfect, was sculpted so precisely that even now, millennia after his mortal death, the image seemed to breathe. Akhmen-hotep's gaze lingered on the face. The artisans had captured every noble line, every imperious curve of the mouth, every cruel perfection that had once commanded nations. It was a likeness meant to inspire awe and obedience. For centuries, Akhmen-hotep had knelt before that face. Tonight, he would look down upon it for the last time. Around him stood his chosen conspirators, a handful of the tomb guard, their armor lacquered black, their eyes glowing faintly beneath their helms. They had sworn their loyalty to Sutekh-Ramun at their embalming, but time had corroded even oaths. Akhmen-hotep had whispered promises of power into their withered ears, new honors, eternal command. Their names restored in gold upon the walls of Ka-Sekhet. The dead could still crave glory. And then there were the death scabs, chittering and restless, crawling in black rivers from the cracks in the stone. Each was a living curse, their carapaces inscribed with microglyphs of unbinding. They were sacred creatures of Jaf, bred to devour wards, to gnaw upon the bindings of death itself. Akhmen-hotep had gathered them from the pits beneath the Black Pyramid, feeding them dust of soulstone and whispers of rebellion, until they gleamed with unnatural vitality. He raised his staff, the serpent-headed scepter of Akura, and struck it once upon the floor. The sound was not a clang, but a sigh, soft, yet deep enough to tremble the bones. "Begin," he commanded. At once, the tomb guard moved in perfect unison. 4 of them approached the sarcophagus, driving their khopesh blades into the seams between lid and base. Sparks of blue fire danced as the runes flared in resistance. The death scarabs swarmed up the golden edges, their mandibles clicking in frenzy as they began to eat away the sigils that had sealed the king's rest for 1,000 years. The air turned electric. The temperature dropped until even the embalming oils froze in their vials. From the walls, the carved hieroglyphs began to bleed sand, trickling down like tears. Each rune erased was a law broken, each chisel stroke a prayer undone. The first wards shattered like glass. A scream, distant, ancient, unearthly, echoed through the chamber. It was not a sound of pain, but of awakening. The tomb guard faltered for a heartbeat, their hollow eyes flickering. But Akhmen-hotep's voice cut through the mounting dread. Hold the line. "The king's breath cannot reach you if you stand beneath my shadow." The second ward fell. The scarabs tore through its glyphs like locusts through wheat. The sarcophagus began to glow, not with light, but with the memory of sunlight, a faint radiance that hurt the eyes of the dead. The final ward was the seal of blood and kin, binding father and son in perpetuity. To break it, a bloodline must be severed. Akhmen-hotep turned toward the side chamber where 3 figures knelt, bound and silent. His brothers, lesser princes, embalmed but not yet enthroned, had been roused from slumber for what they had been told was a rite of remembrance. Their hollow eyes lifted to him, uncomprehending. He did not waver. "Forgive me, my brothers," he said softly. "Your loyalty was your doom." With a single gesture he drew the blade from his belt, a curved kris forged from obsidian mixed with human bone. He pressed its edge against each of their throats in turn, chanting words from the scroll of Shai's unmaking. As their embalmed flesh parted, no blood flowed, only sand, pale and whispering, spilling onto the floor in slow, steady streams. The air grew thick with the scent of myrrh and rot. When the last of them fell silent, the seal of blood cracked like thunder. The sarcophagus pulsed once, violently, shaking dust from the ceiling. Akhmen-hotep raised his staff high. By the names of gods forgotten, by the sands that bury all crowns, I command the gates of death to open. The scarabs screeched as one. The tomb guard fell to their knees, their helms rattling. The golden lid of the sarcophagus began to shift inch by inch, the grinding of stone upon stone, a sound like a mountain dying. From within poured a light so cold and white that it turned the world monochrome. Akhmen-hotep's wrappings fluttered as unseen winds howled through the chamber. The light coalesced into a spectral shape above the open sarcophagus, a towering form, regal and furious, crowned with flame. Sutekh-Ramun's spirit had awakened. Its voice filled the air like the rolling of tomb doors across the desert. Who dares disturb the sleep of kings? The tomb guard dropped their weapons. The death scarabs hissed and burned to ash under the spirit's gaze. Akhmen-hotep stepped forward, every motion slow, deliberate, each word measured and laced with venom. It is I, your son, the faithful one, the forgotten one, the true heir to Ka-Sekhet. The spirit regarded him, and in that instant, eternity passed between them. A father's pride curdled into rage, a son's love drowned by ambition. You would steal my throne? The Leech King thundered. No, Akhmen-hotep said, his voice a whisper that carried through the roar. I would claim it. He thrust the scepter into the heart of the spectral light. The serpent's mouth opened, and from it poured a torrent of binding energy, dark violet and black, the essence of stolen souls. The spirit screamed, twisting, its crown shattering into sparks. Akhmen-hotep pressed harder, invoking every forbidden word he had learned, until the light collapsed into the sarcophagus like a candle snuffed out. When the silence returned, it was vast. The sarcophagus no longer glowed. It was still, inert, yet changed. The hieroglyphs that once spelled Sutekh-Ramun now twisted, reshaping into new forms, spelling a single name. Akhmen-hotep. He lowered his staff, trembling, not from weakness, but from awe. He could feel it, power coursing through his desiccated veins, filling the emptiness within his chest. The tombs around him seemed to bend in acknowledgement. The sands outside shifted as though bowing. His father's essence was his now, his spirit devoured, his kingdom bound. And so, within that silent chamber of betrayal, amidst the ashes of kin and the whispers of dying gods, Akhmen-hotep the usurper was born. The sands of Nehekhara would never sleep again. Chapter 4. The Crown of Dust. The sun rose blood-orange over Ka-Sekhet, but its warmth never touched the bones of the city. Light filtered through the golden haze, refracting off ancient towers and colonnades like rays through amber. But beneath the grandeur, something had changed. The city breathed differently now. Where once there had been solemn stillness, a silent reverence governed by the long-dead hand of King Sutekh-Ramun, now the air carried a pulse, a new rhythm, slow and coiled like a predator's breath. Akhmen-hotep stood at the summit of the obsidian spire, a ziggurat so steep it cut the clouds on windless days. It had once served as his father's throne temple, but he had stripped it of all its former icons. The banners bearing the jackal-headed visage of Sutekh-Ramun had been torn down, reduced to ash in ceremonial braziers now burning with blue flame. The frescoes, once carved in praise of his father's eternal reign, had been hammered into dust and swept away by enslaved winds. Now, at its apex, Akhmen-hotep knelt before the newly forged crown of eternal dominion. It lay upon a slab of meteoric stone, black and veined with silver, as if the heavens had bled molten star iron upon the earth. The crown was unlike any artifact known in Nehekhara. It was forged not by mortal smiths, but by the spells of necrotects and the shaping will of Akhmen-hotep himself. Crafted in the crypt vaults below the citadel, using the gold torn from the mouths of false kings. Its base was a ring of blackened gold, each link etched with sigils of dominance, ancient hieroglyphs that shimmered with ever-shifting color, like oil on water. Rising from the band were 3 serpents wrought of obsidian and soul steel, coiling into spirals that merged at the crown's peak. Each serpent's mouth bore a jewel, not ruby, not sapphire, but something darker, older. The fossilized hearts of treacherous kings, pried from their chests in forgotten war. Akhmen-hotep raised the crown in both hands. It was impossibly heavy, not in weight but in presence. The air hummed with it, the stones beneath him quivered, even the light dimmed as though the very sun hesitated to witness what came next. He lowered the crown upon his head. The world exploded, not in sound but in sensation. A tide of power surged through his desiccated form, flooding his soul, expanding his awareness in every direction at once. He felt the bones of the city. Every skeleton buried beneath Ka-Sekhet sang to him in silent recognition. He felt the presence of Ushabti, frozen in temple alcoves, their minds like hibernating statues that stirred at his thought. He felt the dust itself, yes, even the sand respond, shifting minutely as if seeking his favor. The crown of eternal dominion had no voice, but it spoke in feeling, raw, undeniable supremacy. With a thought, he extended his will, and the legions of Ka-Sekhet, scattered across their crypts, mausoleums, and catacombs, woke. One by one, the tombs cracked open. Sarcophagi split, their golden bindings falling away like husks. Warriors long thought silent rose, arms crossed over their chests, eyes glowing faintly. Archers with bows of bone, charioteers with wheels creaking under centuries of stillness, spear-bearing phalanxes, once led to conquest and death alike, all emerged, not to question, but to serve. But Akhmen-hotep was not content with reawakening the past. He was a king reborn, not a steward of another's vision. In the great plaza of the ancients, beneath the gaze of gods long forgotten, he summoned his necrotects, mummified artisans bound by oath and enchantment to shape death itself, and laid forth his decree. Tear down every likeness of Sutekh-Ramun, remove his name from the stone, strip his mark from every shield and chariot. His empire was one of stagnation. Mine shall move like serpents across the sand. And so began the transformation. Every warrior of Ka-Sekhet was stripped of their old regalia. The linen wrappings were rebound with cords dyed in onyx and emerald, the old emblems of life replaced with serpent glyphs, symbols of cunning, adaptability, and lethal patience. Their armor was reforged in the hidden forges beneath the sepulchral halls, plates of black gold hammered thin as paper, yet harder than steel. The helmets were reshaped into snarling serpent visors, their eyes hollow sockets that glowed with inner fire. Each soldier bore shields engraved with the auroras, the eternal serpent devouring its own tail, a symbol that now adorned every gate and tower of the capital. Chariots were no longer drawn by mere skeletal horses, but by bone serpents animated by soul cinders, their movements sinuous and unnatural. Catapults were redesigned to hurl scarab urns, which exploded on impact into clouds of flesh-eating insects. Monuments were reshaped to reflect this new order. Massive statues of Akhmen-hotep with cobra hoods and crook and flail crossed at his chest, standing tall where once his father's likeness had loomed. Even the great mortuary sphinx, a creature slumbering since the time before memory, was summoned from its mausoleum. Under Akhmen-hotep's command, its face was chiseled anew, his features now carved in stone, eternal and imperious, set beneath a headdress of coiling vipers. The city became his mirror, but it was more than aesthetics, it was philosophy. Serpent kind did not rule with brute force alone. They observed, they waited, then struck with precision. Akhmen-hotep's legions now drilled in silence, moving in perfect formation, not with shouted orders but with mental command. His priests rewrote the Book of the Dead to include his name in every rite. His spies, silent acolytes with mouths sewn shut, traveled on ghost winds to the outer tomb cities, spreading whispers of Ka-Sekhet's rebirth. The first to kneel were the lesser Barrow kings of Ankar and Jafari. Their emissaries arrived bearing salt and obsidian, symbols of submission and sacrifice. Others would follow, and as night fell once more over Ka-Sekhet, the city blazed not with torches, but with soul flames. Every tower top shimmered with spectral fire, casting shadows across the dunes that moved on their own accord. Akhmen-hotep stood once more atop the obsidian spire, now not in mourning or contemplation, but in command. The crown of dust burned cold upon his brow, but his heart, though dead, hungered still. Not for vengeance, that was done. For dominion, for eternity. And in the distance, far beyond the reach of mortal vision, something stirred, something old. Sutekh-Ramun's name had been erased from the stone, but not from vengeance. Chapter 5. The Curse Awakens. Far beyond the walls of Ka-Sekhet, beyond the breath of any living wind, in the dead zone between time and forgetting, the sands began to move, not with storm or tremor, but with a slow, deliberate shudder. The Valley of the Drowned Moon, an accursed stretch of dunes untouched by caravan or necromancer, lay undisturbed for 1,000 years. Here the stars hung motionless, as if watching with bated light. The wind never howled, no jackal barked, no bird dared cross its silence. It was a place spoken of in hushed tones by tomb priests, a wound in the desert where things buried too deep were never truly dead. And there, beneath the buried ruin of a sunken pyramid, he stirred. King Sutekh-Ramun, once ruler of Ka-Sekhet, firstborn of Seti-Ra, scourge of the Black Oasis, and bearer of the eye-flame diadem. A monarch whose soul had been bound not just to his sarcophagus, but to the ley lines of Nehekhara itself, etched into the bedrock through spells whispered by long-extinct priests. And now, unseated, his sarcophagus defiled, his name carved out from the Book of Kings. His essence had been shattered by Akhmen-hotep's spell, true, but not destroyed. What remained had fallen, spiraling into the sub-realms between undeath and oblivion, where memory becomes hunger and oaths become chains. It was from that abyssal void that the first scream echoed. Not heard, but felt. A vibration across the weave of Shaish, the death wind, like a storm's whisper behind every tomb wall and every sealed crypt. In the deserts of the east, skeletons stirred restlessly in their pits. In the catacombs of Zandri, embalmed war priests clutched at their empty eyes. In the silence beneath New Mass, stone lids cracked with hairline fracture. The scream grew, coiling like a spiral of agony around the mortal realm until it pierced through the veil. A sandstorm began to form over the Valley of the Drowned Moon. But this was no natural tempest. The sands rose in vertical columns, spinning not with wind, but with will. The heart of the storm glowed faintly blue, then green, then a deep diseased violet, the color of defiled resurrection. Within that spiraling maelstrom, the spirit of Sutekh-Ramun took form. Not as he had once been, a majestic king clad in polished gold and lapis, flanked by banners and sacred lions, but as something born of betrayal and fury. His form was half-cell, flickering with ghost fire and storm-wrought bone. His once pristine face had cracked, revealing a hollow skull beneath, crowned in the twisted memory of his diadem. His voice no longer spoke in words but in pulses of thought that flayed the mind. And the curse began. It swept first across the dunes, riding on winds that should not exist. This was not the cooling breeze of desert twilight or the sharp gusts of a brewing khamsin. This was something else. A necrotic gale, imbued with the spite of a dethroned god. Where it passed, life withered instantly. Thorn bushes turned to ash, jackals twisted into gnarled things with too many legs and empty sockets. Scorpions crawled from their holes, hissing, their chitin flaking like charred bark. But the dead were worse. Beneath the shifting dunes, corpses long at rest began to stir, but they did not rise whole or noble. The necrotic wind warped them, reshaped them with rage. Skeletons reassembled themselves in grotesque forms, spines twisted into serpentine loops, ribs folding into cage-like maws, skulls splintered and reformed into multi-faced horrors. Warriors who had once marched in rank now slithered and crawled, dragging jagged limbs through the sand. Some grew too tall, warped by the storm's hate, giant, hunched monstrosities of brittle bone and bloated sinew, draped in ruined banners that flapped with no wind. Others crawled on all fours, like dogs made from gravewood and gristle, howling soundlessly as their jaws dislocated with every step. These were not the proud dead of Nehekhara. These were the Forsaken, revenants born of blasphemed kingship. And at their center, Sutekh-Ramun's spirit turned his gaze southward, toward Ka-Sekhet, glowing in the distance with its towers of black gold and banners bearing the sigil of the serpent. His serpent, stolen, each beat of his fractured soul rippled outward, infecting the winds of magic. Death mages across the land convulsed as their rites failed, as their connections faltered. The gods themselves turned away, unwilling to look upon the storm rising from the corpse of a king betrayed. From the depths of the sandstorm, Sutekh-Ramun raised his hand, skeletal and wreathed in fire. And from across the desert, a single word echoed into the hearts of all who still remembered. Usurper. The sands churned, the wind screamed, and the war for Nehekhara's soul had begun. Chapter 6. Sandstorm of Souls. The first warning came as a whisper. It slithered through the cracks of Ka-Sekhet's ancient stone, curling around the feet of the sentinels who guarded its gates. The skeleton warriors, motionless for centuries, turned their hollow sockets toward the horizon. The wind had changed. It carried a voice, low, distant, and endless. A sound like sighing sand dragged across tomb lids. At first, Akhmen-hotep ignored it. From the summit of the obsidian spire he stood before his newly forged throne, carved from meteoric iron and engraved with coiling serpents that seemed to move when no one watched. His dominion stretched across the desert. His armies, reborn and resplendent in black gold armor, marched in perfect silence, awaiting his command. Yet something was wrong with the air. Even the embalmed priests of Jaf, who tended the necropolis, felt it. The incense burners flickered, their flames bending unnaturally toward the open desert. The hieratic wards etched into temple walls began to sweat tar, and the eyes of statues wept streams of sand. When the first gust struck Ka-Sekhet, the impact was soft, a sigh against the walls. Then came another, then another, each heavier than the last. The sky began to dim, swallowing the light of Tran's sun behind a veil of ochre and red. From his high balcony, Akhmen-hotep watched as the horizon blackened, a massive storm front coiling like a living thing. It moved not as nature's storms do. Its edges pulsed, its center seethed with light and shadow in equal measure. The desert itself seemed to rise and devour the world. Bolts of black lightning lanced through the clouds, but they made no sound, only silence deeper than death. And within that silence the voices began. At first they were faint, hollow murmurs that slipped between heartbeats, too soft to name. Then they grew louder, weaving through the storm like threads of agony, thousands of voices crying in despair, pleading in languages long lost to the living. The living Akhmen-hotep, son of the sunless king. And it calls, he calls, he calls. The voices were not of mortals. They were the souls of the damned, warriors, priests, and kings bound to the old order, torn now from the sands by a will stronger than death itself. Akhmen-hotep gripped the railing of his balcony, the black gold metal groaning under his strength. He could feel it, an unnatural pull upon the winds of Shish, the necromantic current that fed his reign. It was being drained, leaching away toward the storm. His hollow heart stilled. "Father," he whispered. The word turned to ash in his mouth. From the depths of the storm, shapes began to emerge, vague at first, then sharpened into nightmares. An army marched within the storm. They did not walk as his legions did, orderly, precise, regal in their silence. No, these were twisted mockeries of the dead. Skeletons bent backward, their spines warped into serpentine arcs, warriors whose limbs elongated like whips of bone, mummified husks flayed by unseen winds, their wrappings torn and reknotted into grotesque banners. And above them, suspended in the heart of the storm like a sun eclipsed, loomed a spectral colossus, a figure vast as a temple, its crown blazing with ghost fire, its body woven of smoke and bone dust. The face was cracked, but Akhmen-hotep knew it. He would know it until the end of all worlds. Sutekh-Ramun, the storm howled with his fury. "You would wear my crown," the voice bellowed, not from the sky, but from within Akhmen-hotep's own skull. "You would steal my rest, my flesh, my soul, my kingdom, you, my blood, my shame." Akhmen-hotep staggered. The power of the voice was overwhelming, each word a hammer striking the core of his spirit. Around him, his servants fell to their knees. The necrotecs screamed, their papyrus skins splitting as the hieroglyphs carved into them ignited. Even the massive obsidian spire groaned, its runes flaring like veins of molten glass. The storm struck the city walls with apocalyptic force. The sands clawed at the stone like living beasts. The gates of Ka-Sekhet shuddered as the first wave of the cursed dead slammed into them, skeletal hands breaking like glass against the obsidian, but reforming in moments. Every grain of sand in the storm carried a soul, and every soul screamed. Akhmen-hotep raised his staff, the serpent-headed scepter of Akhura, and roared back against the gale. "You are dead, old king, forgotten. I am the Scion eternal. I am the king of dust and dominion." He thrust the staff downward. From the plaza below, the black legions of Ka-Sekhet awoke. Thousands of skeletal warriors turned as one, their eyes lighting in unison with a cold emerald blaze. They formed ranks without a word, shields locking, spears rising, their serpent-crested helms gleaming faintly even through the storm's veil. Behind them, colossal Ushabti lumbered from their alcoves, stone and sinew fused by magic, their hands bearing weapons the size of chariots. Necrotecs staggered from their workshops, casting sigils into the air, summoning golden chains of binding light that wrapped around the city walls. the clash began. Where the storm touched the battlements, it birthed horrors. The cursed dead flung themselves upon the defenders, shrieking without mouths. Bones shattered, sand screamed, and the air filled with the crack of magic colliding. The necromantic energies of Akhmen-hotep's power met the defiled wrath of his father, and the two forces clashed like clashing suns. Above it all, the spectral form of Sutekh-Ramun extended one enormous hand. Lightning of pale flame struck the obsidian spire, and for an instant, the entire city was illuminated in ghastly white. Every soul in Ka-Sekhet heard it, the sound of the dead remembering their oaths. Many faltered, some turned. Among the ranks of Akhmen-hotep's army, warriors began to convulse, their armor rattling as unseen hands tore at their souls. The glyphs of loyalty burned away, replaced by the old sigil of the jackal. These traitors, his own creations, turned their spears inward, slaughtering their brethren with mechanical precision. The usurper king's fury was cold and absolute. He raised both arms, drawing from the crown of dust, channeling the raw current of Shyish through his desiccated veins. Blue fire cascaded from his hands, sweeping across the plaza, purging the traitors in waves of spectral flame. Their ashes rose into the storm, only to be consumed by it. But still the storm grew. Still his father laughed. "You cannot kill what you are made of," the voice thundered. "You stole my soul to make your throne. You built your empire upon my grave. I am within you, Akhmen-hotep. Every breath, every whisper, every thought of glory, mine." The storm expanded, swallowing the outer walls of Ka-Sekhet whole. The statues of serpent kings toppled and shattered. The soul flames that lit the towers flickered and went out, one by one. Akhmen-hotep stood upon his balcony, his wrappings fluttering wildly in the storm's fury, and stared into the heart of the tempest. Within it, he saw not merely his father's ghost, but something greater, a memory of the godhood that had once touched their bloodline. He knew then that this was no mere haunting. This was judgment. The sky cracked open. The sand screamed louder. The war for the soul of Ka-Sekhet had begun, and the storm would not pass until one king alone stood amidst the ruins, crowned or cursed, forever. Chapter 7. The Broken Obelisk. The storm had not ended. It had merely shifted its gaze. For 3 days and nights, Ka-Sekhet stood battered beneath skies the color of bruised gold. The sand no longer howled in ceaseless rage, yet it hung in the air like dust upon a tomb, thick and heavy, as if the world itself refused to exhale. The light of Pra struggled to break through the haze, dim and red, casting the city in perpetual twilight. The Black Legions no longer marched. They stood frozen in formation across the plazas and avenues, motionless as statues. The storm's fury had passed, but its echo remained inside every warrior, every piece of carved stone, every grain of sand. Even the obsidian spire, heart of the necropolis, groaned like something half alive, its foundations thrumming with a low, ceaseless vibration. The crown of eternal dominion sat heavy on Akhmen-hotep's brow. He had not removed it since the storm began. Its weight had changed. Once a symbol of dominion, now it pulsed like a living heart, its serpentine crest flickering with spectral light. It whispered. It murmured. It remembered, and so did he. The memory of his father's voice still throbbed within his skull. Even silence felt crowded, as though unseen eyes pressed upon his thoughts. When he closed his lids, he saw that towering figure of wrath within the storm, the ghost of Sutekh-Ramun, and heard that single damning word echo through eternity. Usurper. Akhmen-hotep's wrath simmered like molten gold beneath cracked stone. Yet even fury could not disguise fear. Something still tethered his father's spirit to the mortal realm. He had ordered the scryers of the sepulchral collegium to uncover it. Now, deep within the hall of divinations, they labored around a circular pool of mercury, its surface swirling with faint ripples despite the still air. The chamber's walls were lined with mirrors of polished obsidian, carved with the faces of forgotten gods. Every mirror showed a different reflection, one weeping blood, one whispering names, one simply staring into eternity with hollow eyes. 6 mummified seers stood in a circle around the pool, their hollow throats rasping as they chanted the hymn of the open veil. In their hands they held rods of lapis and bronze, etched with serpents that moved under the skin of the metal. Blue fire burned in their sockets as they bent their will toward the void. The mercury darkened, the temperature dropped. Better. And then it showed them. An image formed upon the liquid, grainy, fractured, as though seen through layers of dream. A valley stretched out before them, far beyond Ka-Sekhet's borders, where dunes met a jagged ridge of black stone. At its center rose a single monolithic obelisk. Shattered at the top, leaning at an impossible angle, its sides covered in hieroglyphs that bled light, but not the light of Nehekhara's gods. This light was wrong. It was a sickly, pulsating fire of deep violet, rimmed with shades of shadow that devoured everything they touched. The glyphs themselves writhed like living wounds, rearranging and reforming every few heartbeats. From its base spread cracks in the sand, radiating outward like veins, glowing faintly, as if the desert itself had become infected. When the image sharpened, Akhmen-hotep saw that the glyphs upon the obelisk were not mere symbols of language. They were names. Names carved in agony. Names of the dead. And at the obelisk's broken peak, a figure writhed. Vast, spectral, half-formed. His father, Sutekh-Ramun. The seers recoiled as the mercury bubbled violently, the image distorting as if struggling to break free from its confines. The voices of the damned spilled from their reflection, thousands wailing in unison, a chorus of torment. The pool boiled over, splattering silver drops that sizzled into smoke upon the floor. Akhmen-hotep raised his hand, and the chanting ceased. The storm was no mere vengeance, he said, his voice like a rasping whisper through parchment. It was a birth. My father has anchored his essence to that place. High Seer Kepura, oldest of the circle, bowed his withered head. The obelisk predates even Ka-Sekhet, my king. Some say it was raised in the first age, before Setra's line, a beacon of divine will, a conduit between the realms. A conduit, Akhmen-hotep murmured, pacing around the pool. Or a chain. The seer nodded. If the soul of Sutekh-Ramun has bound itself to that relic, it draws from the winds of Shaish itself. To destroy it may sever his spirit, or unmake the boundary that restrains him, another seer finished softly. For a long moment only the faint hiss of the dying mercury filled the air. Akhmen-hotep looked again into the fading image of the obelisk, its runes shifting, its fire bleeding upward into the storm-scarred sky. He could feel it even from here, a slow, steady thrum that echoed with his father's hatred. The land was sick because of it. Since the storm's retreat, the crops of the living provinces had blackened into dust. The sacred oases had turned to pools of tar. The desert winds whispered the name Sutekh-Ramun through the dunes. The necropolis itself, the heart of his empire, had begun to decay. The statues crumbled. The bones of warriors cracked as if under unseen pressure. The eternal city was rotting from within. He clenched his hand until flakes of gold-leaf skin fell from his knuckles. "Prepare the chariots of black sand," he commanded, "and summon the vizier of the dead. We march at dusk." The seers looked at one another, the unspoken fear moving through them like a chill. "Majesty," whispered Khepora, "if the obelisk falls, it may unbind not only your father's soul, but the enchantments that anchor Ka-Sekhet itself. The foundations of our eternity may crumble. The winds may scatter even us." Akhmen-hotep turned toward him, the crown of dust burning brighter upon his brow. "Eternity is nothing if I rule it shackled to another's shadow," he said. "Would you have me bow to a ghost?" The seers fell silent. Outside, the city shuddered. A distant sound, deep and resonant, echoed from beneath the earth, a single toll like the striking of a colossal gong. The black fire atop the temple spires flickered and dimmed. In that instant, Akhmen-hotep felt it, a pull, faint but unmistakable, dragging at his very soul. The obelisk was calling him, not with words but with memory, 1,000 fragments of a father's voice, a king's laughter, the clang of swords, the scent of oil and incense and old pride. He realized then that the bond between them had not been broken, only inverted. His father's spirit was not merely bound to the obelisk, it was bound to him. And through that tether, Sutekh-Ramun saw every thought, every fear, every doubt. Akhmen-hotep's grip tightened on his scepter. The serpent head glimmered faintly in the gloom, its jeweled eyes alive with cold fire. "Then let him see," he whispered. "Let him see the strength of the son who cast down the father." He turned toward the balcony. The horizon blazed faintly with that same unnatural violet light, even through the veil of sand. It pulsed in rhythm with the beat of his heart. Akhmen-hotep raised his hand toward it, and his legions stirred in the streets below. Thousands of skeletal warriors turned their heads as one, armor clattering like distant thunder. The king's voice carried over the dead city, echoing against the stone towers, heavy with wrath and glory. "We ride for the valley of corruption. We ride to tear the heart from the ghost of a king." As the army prepared, the scryers bowed in fear, for, behind Akhmen-hotep's command, they heard a second voice, soft, mocking, ancient, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Yes, my son, ride to me, for the curse does not end with the father. It begins with the heir." Chapter 8. The Siege of the Shifting Pyramid. The sun never truly rose on the day the siege began. Ka-Sekhet, the eternal city, sat cloaked in a veil of ash-colored dusk. What little light filtered through the cursed skies gave no warmth, only a gray pallor that made bone and stone indistinguishable. From the high towers of the obsidian spire, Akhmen-hotep watched, as the land beyond his walls writhed like a living wound. The sands no longer moved with the whim of the wind. They shifted deliberately like serpents coiling in the grip of a great beast buried beneath the dunes. Hills rose and fell in unnatural pulses, and shapes, distant, skeletal, and many-limbed, emerged with every wave of earth. The enemy had come. Sutekh-Ramun's vengeful horde, birthed from the storm, marched in solemn silence. Yet the air thrummed with unspoken hatred. Towering banners, torn and blackened, rose among the ranks, each bearing the jackal-headed sigil of the old king, now aflame with spectral fire. Akhmen-hotep recognized many of the names carved into those banners. They were his generals once. Priests, princes, nobles of the inner tombs, those who had refused his call or perished during the great unbinding. Now their corpses had been twisted, warped by the curse, their loyalty returned to the father who should have rested beneath the sands forever. At the center of the horizon stood the shifting pyramid, an unnatural structure half buried in sand and shadow. It had not existed days ago. Formed from the storm itself, its black stone oozed like wax under unseen heat, changing shape by the hour. Its apex twisted in a slow spiral, defying gravity, dripping corrupted ichor onto the ground below. From its base came the army. Thousands of skeletal warriors marched with mechanical precision, their armor rusted but enchanted, glowing faintly with the flame of betrayal. Among them strode monstrous ushabti, no longer carved in honor of gods, but reshaped into grotesque parodies. Elongated limbs, gaping mouths, some fused with the bones of beasts, their shrieks echoing like metal on stone. But the worst of them, the scorpion riders, crawled like nightmares. Riding upon the backs of massive, undead scorpions the size of chariots, these warriors bore curved blades and staffs, crackling with violet lightning. Their segmented mounts clicked and hissed, their tails lashing the air with poisoned barbs enchanted to sever the soul. The dust beneath them melted into blackened glass where their legs touched. Akhmen-hotep turned from the balcony and raised the scepter of Akra. The black serpent at its tip hissed once, and the command spread like wildfire. The streets of Ka-Sekhet came alive. From crypts, plazas, and catacombs, the Black Legions marched. Armored in obsidian and gold, bearing shields carved with the Ouroboros, their ranks assembled with chilling grace. Every movement was measured, perfect. No shouts, no chaos, just silence and purpose. Chariots of ashwood and bone rolled through the city gates, drawn by skeletal beasts whose eyes glowed with searing white light. Drivers with no tongues pulled taut the reins, while archers stood poised with soul-tipped arrows. The sky cracked above as necrotex and mortuary priests summoned great war golems, effigies of serpents, jackals, and lions carved from sandstone and given breath through ritual flame. They lumbered forward, their heavy steps shaking the ground. Akhmen-hotep descended the spire, his cloak trailing like smoke, his voice amplified by the winds themselves. "Let the curse come," he thundered. "Let the dead rise. I am the king of dust. I am the heir to eternity." He raised both arms, and the walls of Ka-Sekhet shifted, moving with a will of their own. Ancient stone blocks realigned, carving fresh glyphs into their surfaces. Obelisks hummed with power, firing beams of necrotic energy into the distant sands. Shields of ghost light shimmered around the city, flickering like desert mirages. And then the two armies collided. The scorpion riders struck first, darting through the dunes with unnatural speed, their mounts leaping over stone barricades, lashing tails impaling skeletal warriors by the dozens. Their riders chanted curses in the language of the pre-dynastic kings, shattering shields with words alone. Akhmen-hotep's chariots of the serpent moon responded in kind. They hurtled through the gates with thunderous velocity, wheels slicing through bone and steel alike. Spears and blades clashed mid-charge, sending fragments of ancient warriors flying in all directions. The ushabti of both sides met like gods of stone. A colossal lion-headed statue wrenched the arm from its jackal-faced counterpart, only to be impaled through the chest by a flail the size of a tree trunk. Each blow echoed across the battlefield like the tolling of temple bells, calling the dead to war. Above it all, Akhmen-hotep strode into battle upon a chariot wreathed in living serpents, each one whispering incantations in a different tongue. At his side rode Vizier Menkar-Re, the last of the silent choir, whose voice could turn flesh to dust and stone to powder. Together, they carved through the cursed ranks, Akhmen-hotep's scepter lashing out with arcs of black lightning. Each strike shattered enchantments, each word of command unraveled spells woven into bone. But for every enemy that fell, another rose. The sands beneath the battlefield had become corrupted, an open wound feeding on death. Every warrior slain fed the storm. The more they fought, the stronger Sutekh-Ramun's presence became. His laughter thundered from the pyramid, deep and eternal. "Bleed for me, my son. Build my throne from your pride." The walls of Ka-Sekhet trembled as fissures opened in the outer wards. Necromantic energies bled into the foundations. Temples cracked, statues groaned, the city's soul strained under the weight of a father's wrath. And yet Akhmen-hotep stood, unyielding. He knew now that the pyramid was not merely a fortress. It was a wound, a place where the soul of his father fed upon the land. The battle was not just for the city. It was for reality itself. He turned to Nehekhara. "Send the ass blades. Cut through the center. I go for the heart." The vizier bowed, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The ass blades, his elite guard of whispering assassins, darted into the fray, ghosts wrapped in shadow and bone, each armed with daggers that drank magic like water. Akhmen-hotep pointed his scepter toward the shifting pyramid, now rising even higher in the distance, twisting as it consumed the battlefield. "I end this," he swore, voice shaking the air itself. "I burn the wound closed." And as the battle raged around him, scorpions lunging, bones shattering, magic screaming, the usurper king rode into the storm. Toward the shifting pyramid, toward his father's ghost, toward the final truth that no crown could hide. Would you like an image to illustrate this chapter's climactic siege, depicting Akhmen-hotep's black gold legions clashing with Sutekh-Ramun's, cursed undead, beneath the looming, shifting pyramid? Chapter 9. The Scroll of Shay's Doom. The battlefield still burned when Akhmen-hotep withdrew from the siege. The sands beyond Ka-Sekhet glowed faintly in the dark, like the embers of a dying sun. Winds howled low across the desert, carrying with them the ashes of thousands of warriors, bone dust, rusted gold, and shattered fragments of enchantment. The air itself shimmered with necrotic residue, a bitter haze that tasted of blood and forgotten prayers. The usurper king stood at the edge of his city, his obsidian chariot half sunken in the sand. His armor was cracked, his wrappings torn and blackened by the touch of unholy flame. His scepter trembled faintly in his grip, though whether from fatigue or fury, none could say. The siege had not broken him, but it had bled him. For every 1,000 of his warriors slain, 10,000 of his fathers rose anew, drawn from the ever-churning sands that obeyed the will of the dead king. Each strike against Sutekh-Ramun's army only fed the curse that consumed the land. Akhmen-hotep knew now that no sword, no spell of domination, no wall of stone could end his father's vengeance. What he needed was something older, something forbidden, something that could rewrite fate itself. The answer had come from the trembling lips of a dying priest, one who had served Sutekh-Ramun before the rebellion, a withered creature dragged from the storm's wreckage. His voice had been little more than a rattle of dust, yet his words burned like revelation. "The scroll of Shay's doom," the priest had whispered, "the words of the gods that bind the destinies of kings. Lost in the tomb of Numus, where time and shadow sleep, only it can unmake what has been written. Numus, a city of ruin and madness, long consumed by the curse of its own hubris, a necropolis older than Ka-Sekhet, built upon a foundation of bones so vast it was said the desert still shifted from the weight of the dead buried beneath it. None who entered its gates returned, not priests, not necromancers, not even the carrion birds that hunted its edges. It was said that the gods themselves had turned their faces from it, and at its heart, they whispered, slept a guardian who judged not the body, but the soul. So Akhmen-hotep went alone. The journey to Numis was like crossing into a fever dream. The dunes stretched endlessly under a sky that never changed, lit by neither sun nor moon, only the pale and shifting glow of the cursed horizon. Shadows moved within the sand, figures that seemed to follow him but vanished when faced directly. The desert whispered in voices that sounded like his own, mocking, pleading, remembering. For 3 nights he walked beneath the light of more asleep, the green moon, whose bloated reflection painted the dunes in sickly hues. The farther he traveled, the quieter the desert became, until even the wind died. Not a grain of sand stirred. The silence was so deep it pressed against his ears, like the ocean depths. On the dawn of the 4th day, though dawn was only a dimming of shadow rather than light, he reached it. Numis. The city rose from the desert like the ribcage of a dead god. Towers split open, their spires leaning at impossible angles. Walls had half melted into their foundations, as though burned by divine fire. Rivers of black glass cut through the ruins, marking where once canals had run. And above it all, upon a cracked dais at the city's center, crouched the Sphinx of Shai. It was vast, larger than any temple statue, carved not from stone, but from something that glimmered like moonlit flesh. Its leonine body rippled with muscles that should not have moved, its wings folded but restless, and its human face was veiled beneath a mask of hammered gold. Its eyes, 2 pits of sapphire flame, stared unblinking at the horizon. As Akhmen-hotep approached, the sand beneath his feet shuddered. The Sphinx's claws, each the length of a spear, flexed and sank deeper into the ground. Its voice came not from its mouth, but from the air itself. 1,000 whispers fused into one, vibrating through the marrow of the world. Akhmen-hotep, son of Sutekh-Ramun, thief of crowns, breaker of oaths, you come seeking the words of Shai. The king stood his ground, though his spirit quaked. I come to end the curse, he said. The old king's soul poisons Nehekhara. The land withers, the dead revolt. I will set the balance right. A sound rumbled from the Sphinx's chest, a sound like laughter, though it shook the very ground. Balance? You would speak of balance, who devoured your father's soul and chained your own blood to eternity? No, you come for power. The scroll does not answer prayers, it answers truth. It rose slowly, unfolding its wings. The shadow it cast stretched for miles, swallowing the ruins whole. To claim the scroll of Shai's doom, the Sphinx said, you must first face the judgment of your own soul. Speak the truth of your reign, Akhmen-hotep. Who are you? The air around him grew heavy, the desert blurred, and then he was not standing before the Sphinx anymore. He stood instead within his own city, Ka-Sekhet, but not as it was. The streets were filled with screams, the sky burned red, his armies fought among themselves, tearing each other apart. Statues toppled, temples bled. His face, his own likeness carved into the spire, split down the middle, and from within it another face emerged, his father's. He turned, and there stood Sutekh-Ramun, not in wrath, but in calm disappointment. His eyes, though hollow, burned with something deeper than hatred. You wish to be remembered, said the shade, to be eternal. But eternity is not dominion, it is decay. You sought freedom from my rule, yet you built the same tyranny in your image. Tell me, Akhmen-hotep, was it worth the crown? The king tried to speak, but his throat was filled with dust. His hands trembled. Every victory, every monument, every sacrifice flashed before him. The priests burned for defiance, the brothers slaughtered for ambition, the land reshaped in his name. He saw not a king, but a mirror of his father. He fell to his knees. I sought only to be more than your shadow, he whispered. The vision dissolved. He was back in Numaz, kneeling before the Sphinx. The creature's eyes blazed brighter now, piercing him to his very core. "You have spoken the truth. For that I grant you passage." With a thunderous crack, the ground before the Sphinx split open, revealing a staircase that descended into blackness. The air reeked of myrrh, dust, and time. Akhmen-hotep descended alone. The deeper he went, the colder it became, until frost gathered upon the edges of his armor. The tunnel opened into a circular chamber, its ceiling lost to shadow. At its center, atop a pedestal carved from a single massive femur, lay the scroll of Shai's doom. It was not parchment, but human skin, bound by threads of shadow. The glyphs etched upon it shifted and crawled, rearranging themselves like living things. The air around it hummed with a frequency that made his bones ache. He reached out and hesitated, for he could feel it watching him. The scroll was alive. It pulsed faintly, as though breathing, and in its depths he saw visions. Worlds collapsing, stars fading, gods dying in silence. His voice trembled, though his will did not. "By my blood, by my crown, by my soul, I claim thee." He seized the scroll. The chamber screamed. The walls shuddered, hieroglyphs igniting with blinding light. The bones of the pedestal cracked, releasing plumes of spectral flame. Above, the Sphinx roared, a sound that shook the ruins to their foundations. Akhmen-hotep staggered as the scroll burned in his grasp, searing his flesh, branding its words into his being. He felt time itself twist around him. His father's voice, distant yet thunderous, echoed across the dunes. "You think to rewrite destiny, my son? Then let it be written in your ruin." The city of Numaz began to crumble. Columns fell, statues shattered, and the desert rushed in like a tidal wave. But Akhmen-hotep did not release the scroll. As the sands buried the cursed city, the last light that remained was the green fire of the scroll in his hands and the reflection of his crown gleaming coldly in the darkness. Chapter 10. The Trial of Bone and Memory. Silence. That was the first thing Akhmen-hotep noticed. After the cataclysm of light and flame that had engulfed the chamber, there was no sound, not even the echo of his breath. The heat from the scroll of Shai's doom still lingered on his hands, its power thrumming like a living pulse beneath his wrappings, but the world itself seemed frozen. The sands had fallen still. The flickering light of the torches that had lined the walls now hung suspended, flames motionless, their smoke trapped mid-rise. Akhmen-hotep looked around and found that the chamber was gone. He stood instead in a place between. A sky of gray ash stretched infinitely above him, horizonless and eternal. The ground beneath his feet was neither sand nor stone, but bone, vast, pale, and cold, stretching in every direction like a sea of death. Skulls, half buried in the surface, watched him with hollow eyes. The wind that moved across this wasteland whispered in tongues he could almost recognize, his own language but twisted by time. He was not alone. Before him rose the Sphinx of Shai, no longer still and noble, but alive in terrible majesty, its wings unfurled, casting shadows that reached across the bone plains, and its mask of gold had cracked, revealing a face half human, half skeletal, its eyes twin furnaces of sapphire fire. "The scroll is not won by strength, O King of Dust," the Sphinx said, voice like the grinding of tomb doors. "It is given only to one who faces the truth, buried deepest in his soul." Akhmen-hotep stood tall, his armor gleaming faintly in the dead light. "I have faced every truth. I have lived with every sin. What more can you show me?" The Sphinx leaned closer, its breath colder than the grave. "Memory is a sharper blade than any forged by men, and your memory, drips with blood. The ground trembled. The bones beneath Akhmen-hotep's feet shifted, grinding against one another until they formed a staircase spiraling downward. He descended, unwilling yet compelled, as if something greater than will pulled him onward. At the bottom, he found a door carved from black basalt, marked with a single symbol, the serpent eating its own tail. He touched it, and the world opened. He stood once more in the Hall of Succession, the inner sanctum of Ka-Sekhet, as it had been before the fall. The scent of oil and incense filled the air, mingling with the metallic tang of embalming salts. Golden braziers burned bright, casting light upon walls covered in frescoes depicting the lineage of kings. And there, at the far end of the hall, upon a dais of polished jade, knelt Prince Akhmen-hotep, his younger brother. Even after centuries, the sight pierced Akhmen-hotep like a blade. Akhmen-hotep had been the gentlest of them, wise, patient, a poet and scholar who had dreamed of peace in an age of conquest. He had always smiled when he spoke, his laughter light, his words heavy with compassion. Now he knelt in chains. Guards stood on either side of him, skeletal and unmoving. The sound of chanting filled the air, the priests of Sutekh-Ramun reciting the rites of judgment. Akhmen-hotep remembered this moment. He had lived it once, but memory was mercifully brief. Here it stretched long and cruel, each heartbeat echoing in his skull. He could smell the smoke of the incense, the sharp resin burning in golden bowls. He could hear the rattle of chains as his brother raised his head, eyes meeting his own. "Brother," Akhmen-hotep said softly, voice shaking with grief rather than fear. "You need not do this. Our father's throne is not worth your soul." Akhmen-hotep had heard those words before. They had been the last words his brother ever spoke. But this time they carried something else. Pity. "You were meant to rule beside me," Akhmen-hotep said, his voice trembling as the memory forced itself to life. "But you followed him. You called me traitor before the court." Akhmen-hotep bowed his head. "I called you lost. I begged you to wait, to let our father's time end naturally. You could not abide patience. You have never known it." Anger flared in Akhmen-hotep's chest, just as it had then. He could feel the old heat rising, that poisonous blend of envy and pride. "Would never have yielded," he hissed. "He would have ruled forever as a god upon the earth, and we would have rotted beneath him." His brother met his eyes again, calm and resolute. "Then you would have done as all dutiful sons do. You would have endured." Those words had sealed his fate once before. They sealed it again now. Akhmen-hotep drew his krish blade, its edge glinting red in the torchlight. His hand trembled, not from doubt, but from the memory of what came next. "You think me faithless," he said, "but I do this for the blood of our line." Akhmen-hotep smiled faintly, sorrowfully. "You do it for yourself." And then, with a cry that split the silence, Akhmen-hotep drove the blade home. The scene exploded into motion. The priests shouting, the guards stepping back, the golden bowls spilling flame. Akhmen-hotep's body slumped against him, blood, warm, impossibly warm, spilling across Akhmen-hotep's hands. The smell of myrrh and iron filled the air, but the memory did not fade. It lingered. The blood did not dry. It flowed, endlessly, staining his hands, his armor, his soul. Akhmen-hotep fell to his knees, gasping. "Enough," he cried. "Enough of this. I have seen this 1,000 times in dreams. I know what I did." The Sphinx's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "To know is not to repent. The scroll measures not the truth you see, but the truth you accept." The hall began to dissolve. The torches guttered out, replaced by darkness. The chains fell silent. Only his brother remained, standing now, unbound, whole and radiant. He stepped forward, his eyes glowing faintly with golden light. "You seek to unmake destiny," said Akhmen-hotep. "But tell me, brother, what right has a murderer to command fate?" Akhmen-hotep lifted his gaze. "I did what was necessary to free us all. You freed only yourself, and even then you chained your soul to your ambition." His brother's form flickered. The flesh turned to bone, the bone to dust, until only a ghost remained. "Renounce the crown, and the scroll shall be yours. Cast aside your dominion, and Shai will open the gates of destiny to you." The words echoed through him like thunder. To renounce the crown, to abandon the power he had killed for, bled for, become. He looked down at his hands, blood still slick and red upon them, though no pulse had beat in his veins for centuries. The serpent crown upon his head glimmered faintly, its eyes alive with flickering flame. Could he cast it away? Could he strip from himself the very thing that gave him meaning? He thought of the endless wars, the worship, the monuments raised to his glory, the blood spilled for his dream of empire, the fear, the silence. And beneath it all, he thought of his brother's voice. "You do it for yourself." The Sphinx appeared again, looming tall, its wings spanning the horizon. "Choose, Akhmen-hotep. The crown or the scroll, dominion or redemption." Time slowed. He reached up. For a moment, his hand hovered above the crown. His fingers trembled. The whispers of 1,000 souls clawed at his mind, the voices of his armies, his priests, his kingdom. They cried out for him to remain their king, their God, their eternal master. And beneath those voices, one whisper rose above the rest, Akhmen-hotep's voice. "Let it end, brother. Let it end." Akhmen-hotep closed his eyes. He tore the crown from his head. The world shattered. Light poured from the wound in his soul, searing through the darkness. The crown fell from his grasp and dissolved into dust before it touched the bone floor. The blood on his hands burned away, leaving only pale, empty skin. The Sphinx bowed its massive head. "Then you are judged and found worthy. Take the scroll, bearer of your own damnation. May you wield it wisely, or may it devour you as it has all others." When Akhmen-hotep opened his eyes again, he stood once more in the chamber beneath Numus. The scroll of Shai's doom floated before him, suspended in a column of pale fire. He reached out. This time, the scroll did not resist him. It opened at his touch, its glyphs glowing with blinding radiance. And in the reflection of its light, his brother's face appeared for just a heartbeat, smiling, serene, and fading into the dark. Chapter 11. The Broken Pharaoh. The chamber of Numus was utterly still, the air thick with power so ancient that even the gods seemed to hold their breath. The scroll of Shai's doom floated before Akhmen-hotep like a living flame, its light spilling across the walls in ribbons of shifting glyphs that twisted and rearranged themselves with each flicker. It was not light as mortals would know it. It had weight, taste, scent. It pressed against him like the presence of another being, old as the stars. Akhmen-hotep stood motionless before it. The echoes of his brother's voice still lingered in his mind. Soft, patient, forgiving. Yet his hands did not tremble. His choice had been made, and he would not turn from it. The air thrummed with low, resonant sound, like the heartbeat of a dying world. Around him the tomb walls rippled, the hieroglyphs etched into their surface alive with spectral flame. They told his story. Every sin, every betrayal, every life stolen to feed his hunger for eternity. He watched them unfold like a mirror of his own damnation. Yet there was no regret in his hollow eyes, only understanding. He had traded remorse for purpose long ago. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward. Each footfall echoed like thunder through the endless chamber. As he reached toward the scroll, the symbols upon its surface surged with furious light, flooding his vision until the world vanished. He was no longer in Namas. He stood in his own tomb, deep beneath the city of Ka-Sekhet, the chamber where his mortal body had been laid to rest before the rebellion. Every inch of it was familiar. The gold-veined walls, the statues of his ancestors standing in silent witness, the scent of dust and resin, and at its center lay his sarcophagus. It was a masterpiece of the old empire, crafted from red stone shot through with veins of gold, its surface etched with wards of protection and eternal sovereignty. The image upon its lid was his own likeness, serene, regal, perfect, a god in repose. Akhmen-hotep approached it, the scroll still burning in his hand, its words whispering through the void between heartbeats. To command eternity, you must first forsake it. To bind death, you must become it. He stared down at his own carved face and felt something stir within him, a faint tremor of emotion, half nostalgia, half contempt. This was the vessel that had once held his mortal shell, his bridge between flesh and the afterlife. His father had lain in such a sarcophagus, as had every king before him. They had bound themselves to these tombs, tethering their spirits to the mortal world through sacred geometry and divine will. But this sarcophagus was more than a relic. It was a prison. To wield the scroll, to reshape fate itself, he would have to sever the final tether to his humanity. The rituals of ascension that had granted him unlife had left one fragile thread. His soul, still half bound to this coffin, still able to return to its rest between wars. It was the last mercy the gods had allowed him. Now he must break it. Akhmen-hotep raised the scroll high. The light from its parchment pulsed and swelled, illuminating the chamber in shades of pale blue and ghostly silver. Glyphs uncoiled from its surface, wrapping around his arms like chains of light. The air shook with power. He began to recite the words written upon it, syllables so old that the desert itself seemed to bow beneath their sound. Shai, Lord of the balance, keeper of the thread, hear me. I cast off the flesh of kingship. I break the seal of my own rest. I bind my soul not to the earth nor to the sky, but to the endless sand that devours both. The chamber darkened. From the walls, the painted figures of priests and gods began to move, their eyes burning as they turned toward him. The air filled with the sound of whispering voices, his ancestors, their judgment indistinct, their forms mere shadows of gold and ash. The sarcophagus trembled. Cracks formed across its lid, thin at first, then widening like veins of black lightning. Dust fell in soft spirals, caught in the ghostly light. Akhmen-hotep, the voices murmured, overlapping into a single echo. You would undo what cannot be undone. You would unmake your rest, and all rest. I would make the world remember me, he said, his voice ringing like iron. The scroll's glyphs surged outward, pouring into the air as lines of living fire. They wove themselves around him, etching his body in luminous script. His armor cracked, revealing the desiccated flesh beneath, flesh that writhed and flaked away under the scroll's burning words, until only the raw magic of his being remained. The sarcophagus split apart with a sound like the breaking of the world. A torrent of spectral energy erupted from it, a storm of souls, of memories, of ancient prayers unbound. They whirled around him in a cyclone of ghostlight, screaming, pleading, rejoicing. Within the maelstrom he saw his life unspool in fragments, his father's stern gaze, his brother's smile, the cities he had built and burned, the worshippers who had called his name in fear and awe. He saw it all and accepted it. The scroll's power flooded into him. His essence blazed like a sun of the dead. The chamber melted away, replaced by infinite dunes and skies filled with black fire. He felt himself stretch across the desert, his consciousness expanding until he was part of everything. The wind, the dust, the bone. He was no longer a king of Ka-Sekhet. He was Ka-Sekhet itself. Every crypt, every tomb, every whisper of the dead was his. The rivers of the underworld coursed through his veins. The hieroglyphs of life and death wrote themselves upon his bones. But power was never without price. As his being fused with the land, he felt the last remnants of what had once been human within him. Those faint echoes of warmth, sorrow, memory begin to fade. His brother's face, once so vivid, dimmed to shadow. The laughter of the living, the scent of oil, the whisper of wind upon skin, all of it vanished. He was no longer a man, nor even a soul. He was an idea given shape, a curse clothed in gold. Akhmen-hotep, the broken pharaoh. When the light finally dimmed, the chamber lay in ruin. The sarcophagus had shattered entirely, its fragments scattered like shards of sunstone. The air still hummed with faint echoes of the ritual, the walls lined with fresh carvings, words that had not been there before. They spoke of a king who broke his own rest to command fate. And upon the dais where he had once stood, now there was only a figure of blackened gold, hollow-eyed and crowned with fire. His body was still, yet the air around him pulsed with the rhythm of his new dominion. He had paid the price. He had become eternal, not through the will of gods, but by his own defiance. Far above, the desert stirred. The sands of Nehekhara began to rise in great waves, whispering his name in 1,000 tongues. The dead in their tombs turned their hollow faces toward Ka-Sekhet, as if in recognition of something vast and terrible awakening. And deep beneath the dunes, in the realm where his father's ghost yet raged, a single laugh echoed through eternity, low, cold, and proud. "So be it, my son," the voice of Sutekh-Ramun murmured. "Let us see which of us endures the longer." The wind howled through the ruins of Numas, carrying that laughter across the endless night. And in its wake, the sands whispered the title that would follow Akhmen-hotep until the end of days. The Broken Pharaoh. Chapter 12. Ritual of Eternal Rebellion. The green moon Moor-sleeve hung swollen and diseased in the heavens, its light spilling across the desert like the gaze of a mad god. It cast the dunes of Nehekhara in sickly emerald hues, warping shadow and distance alike, as though the world itself had grown fevered beneath its radiance. The air was thick with anticipation, a silence so profound it felt alive, waiting, listening. In the heart of Ka-Sekhet, deep beneath the shattered obsidian spire, Akhmen-hotep stood within the Hall of Souls, a cavernous chamber carved from the bedrock of the world. Its ceiling rose high into darkness, pierced by narrow shafts that allowed Moor-sleeve's vile glow to pour through in jagged columns of light. Along the walls, towering statues of gods and forgotten kings loomed, their features eroded by time, their eyes filled with black fire. Before the broken pharaoh lay an altar of obsidian, inlaid with veins of gold that pulsed like veins of living flesh. Upon it rested a soul jar, massive and intricately crafted, a vessel of green glass and black stone, etched with glyphs of power that seemed to writhe and shift under the moonlight. Within its hollow center burned a dim, pulsing light, the heart of the ritual to come. The scroll of Shay's doom lay open beside it, its surface crawling with living hieroglyphs. The symbols spiraled across the floor, etching themselves into the stone, forming a vast circle of power that filled the chamber. The words were not read. They were felt. They thrummed through the bones. They shivered through the marrow. Akhmen-hotep raised the scepter of Akkra, its serpent's head alive with spectral flame, and began to speak the words of binding. His voice rolled through the hall, low and commanding, each syllable tearing at the fabric between life and death. By the covenant of dust and darkness, I call upon the balance of Shai. By the breath of the first tomb, by the blood of the last king, I summon the soul of Sutekh-Ramun, that it may be weighed and chained. The chamber shook. The light from Morrislead flared brighter, pouring through the ceiling shafts and columns of burning jade. The glyphs upon the floor ignited, lines of fire racing outward from the altar in all directions, carving themselves into the ancient stone. Around him, the Black Legion stood in silent ranks, thousands of warriors unmoving, their armor glinting like wet ink in the shifting light. Ushabti statues of serpent-headed gods knelt at the edges of the ritual circle, each holding a bowl filled with sacred oils that burned without flame. And at the center of it all stood Akhmen-hotep, no longer flesh, no longer soul, but something vast, his eyes twin stars of blue fire. He began the invocation in earnest, each word a weapon, each breath a blow struck against the spirit of his father. By my will, the usurped becomes the usurper. By my blood the son binds the sire. Rise, Sutekh-Ramun, rise that I may cast thee down once more. The air convulsed. A sound like 1,000 tomb doors grinding open filled the hall. The green light of Morrislead dimmed, as though the moon itself had drawn breath. The temperature plummeted, so low the sands beyond the citadel crystallized, and frost crept along the bones of the undead soldiers like creeping mold. And then came the voice. You call to me, my son. It was not thunder, nor wind, nor whisper. It was all of them, woven together in a single word that carried the weight of centuries. The walls cracked, the statues trembled, and the fires within the oil bowls flared blue. From the fissures in the ground, black sand erupted, swirling into a towering vortex. Within it a shape began to form, a massive, grotesque silhouette, shifting and reshaping as if struggling to contain itself. Akhmen-hotep's grip tightened on the scepter. The vortex collapsed inward, revealing the Death Lord that had once been King Sutekh-Ramun. He was colossal, his body fused with the architecture of his tomb, a monstrous fusion of flesh, bone, and stone. His arms were slabs of basalt carved into the likeness of royal armor, veins of molten light running through the cracks. His torso was a ruin of broken ribs and obsidian shards, from which poured the green fire of undeath. His face, half human, half skull, bore the remains of the golden death mask that had once adorned him in life, now shattered and molten, fused to his jaw. From his back rose the remnants of his pyramid, jagged fragments of black stone hovering in orbit around him, engraved with the same jackal-headed sigil that now bled spectral energy into the air. His eyes burned brighter than Morrislead itself. You dare to summon me here, in my own kingdom? The Death Lord said, each word a quake that shook the pillars. You who fed on my soul, who stole my sarcophagus and forged your crown from my bones. Akhmen-hotep did not kneel. He raised the scroll high, the glyphs of Shai burning white-hot against his arm. You are no king, father. You are a wound that festers. I am the cure. Sutekh-Ramun's laughter shook the world. A cure? You are the infection, my son, the shadow of my sin. You took my blood, my name, my dominion, and thought yourself free. But even your rebellion was written by my hand. He raised his arm, and the walls of the hall exploded outward in a storm of sand and stone. Through the breach poured the spectral army of the Death Lord, the cursed dead, a tide of shrieking spirits and twisted corpses wreathed in violet fire. They fell upon the black legions with soundless fury, bone shattering against bone, spirit rending spirit. The battle of the dead began anew. Akhmen-hotep unleashed his power, slamming the scepter into the ground. A shockwave of necromantic energy rippled outward, toppling enemies by the hundreds. Ghostlight surged through his veins, and every command of his mind was obeyed by the legions still loyal to him. "Form ranks, shield the altar. Let the gods witness that even death itself bends to my will." The Ushabsi roared as they waded into the spectral swarm, their massive stone fists crushing phantoms to mist. Yet for every enemy destroyed, another arose from the sand. At the center of the chaos, Akhmen-hotep and Sutekh-Ramun faced each other, father and son, king and king. Akhmen-hotep raised the scroll of Shai's-Doom high, chanting faster now, his voice echoing through the veil. The glyphs spiraled outward, forming a cage of light around his father's massive form. "By the words of creation, by the laws of balance, I bind thee, Sutekh-Ramun. By dust and death and destiny, I name thee ended." The light closed in, pressing against the Death Lord's form. For a moment it seemed to work. His body faltered, the green fire flickering, the pyramid shards around him cracked, molten edges cooling. But then the ancient king laughed again. "Ended? I am death itself, boy. You cannot cage the river that made you." He reached out, and his hand, vast and burning, closed around the scroll. The light faltered. The parchment screamed, its glyphs flaring in agony as they struggled against his grip. Akhmen-hotep cried out and held fast, his body shaking with the effort. The air between them exploded into brilliance, two powers colliding, father and son, creation and unmaking. The chamber vanished in the conflagration. The sands for miles around Ka-Sekhet rose in spirals, forming towering columns that split the clouds. When the light dimmed, the battlefield was gone. Only the broken remnants of the altar remained, the soul jar cracked but unshattered. And within its fractured surface, two shadows writhed, locked in eternal struggle, their voices fading into silence. The ritual of eternal rebellion had begun, and neither king would ever rest again. Chapter 13. The Duel Beyond Death. The world was gone. No sky, no sand, no wind. Only an endless void of shifting color, where shadows bled into flame and time itself seemed to hold its breath. The desert had fallen away, Ka-Sekhet had dissolved, and the war between the dead had torn the veil between worlds. Here, in this realm between life and eternity, stood two figures, each vast and terrible. Akhmen-hotep, the broken pharaoh, gleamed like a living monolith of black gold and spectral light. His armor had been reforged by the ritual's fury, plates fused with veins of ghostly power, his serpent crown burning with pale flame. In his hands he gripped the khopesh of dominion, its curved blade wreathed in the shifting sigils of Shai, every swing whispering fragments of fate itself. And before him loomed Sutekh-Ramun, his father, now fully revealed in his true form, the Death Lord Eternal. His body was no longer bound by mortal proportion. He was half tomb, half god, his flesh a mosaic of stone and bone, runes of damnation carved into his arms, his crown a broken sun of obsidian shards that orbit his skull like planets. The black flame of the underworld spilled from his ribs with every breath. Between them stretched the battlefield of the afterlife's echo, a plain woven from memory and death. Fragments of pyramids drifted in the air like shattered glass. Rivers of molten gold flowed upward instead of down, and upon every floating terrace stood spectral legions, the ghosts of kings and warriors from every dynasty of Nehekhara, drawn to witness the final reckoning of blood and legacy. Their hollow voices whispered across eternity, Father and Son, Creator and Heir, which shall the gods remember? The silence shattered with the first clash. Akhmen-hotep struck first, his khopesh cutting a line of blue fire through the void. The blade met his father's colossal war staff, a weapon forged from his own tomb's pillar, and the impact sent a shock wave across the realm. Pyramids cracked, rivers stilled. The watching phantoms bowed under the force of it. Sutekh-Ramun countered with a sweep that split the very air, his motion impossibly fluid for something so vast. The blow struck Akhmen-hotep square in the chest, sending him crashing through a wall of spectral glass. He landed upon a terrace made of pure memory, the reflection of Ka-Sekhet in its first glory. The city gleamed as it once had, the streets alive with long-dead citizens who did not see him. He rose slowly, his armor cracked but whole, the fire in his eyes undimmed. "You cannot win," came Sutekh-Ramun's voice, echoing through every stone, every shadow. "You are my reflection. Every strike you make is mine also." Akhmen-hotep spat dust that turned to light as it hit the ground. "Then let the mirror shatter." He charged once more, faster than thought, the khopesh blazing in his hand. He struck high, low, and across, each blow carving runes into the air itself. The sigils flared, forming chains of light that wrapped around his father's arms, tightening like serpents. Sutekh-Ramun bellowed, his voice shaking the bones of creation. He tore the bindings apart with brute force, shards of light scattering like broken stars. With a gesture, he summoned chariots of bone and shadow, each driven by the spirits of his long-dead generals. Their wheels burned with green fire as they descended upon Akhmen-hotep, slicing the air with scythe-bladed rims. But the sun was ready. He raised his scepter, and the chariots of the serpent moon burst from the mists behind him, his own spectral host, resurrected from the memory of Ka-Sekhet's glory. Their serpentine steeds hissed as they met the jackal-headed mounts of the Death Lord's legions. The clash was apocalyptic. Chariots collided mid-air, splintering into cascades of bone and gold. Drivers fell into the void, their screams blending with the wind. Arrows of spectral fire crossed the sky, tracing lines of ancient war songs. The echo of drums thundered, not from mortal instruments, but from the heartbeat of the realm itself, pounding in rhythm with the gods' attention. Through it all, father and son moved like storms given form. Akhmen-hotep leapt from his chariot to meet his father again, blade meeting staff with a force that sent ripples across the void. Sparks of black and gold erupted where their weapons struck, each one birthing a vision, moments of their shared past. He saw himself as a child, kneeling before his father's throne offering tribute. He saw the coronation of Sutekh-Ramun, the cheers of thousands. He saw the moment he had opened his father's sarcophagus. Every clash was a memory given form. Every strike, a story retold in blood and fire. At last, Sutekh-Ramun roared and drove his staff downward, impaling the ground. The battlefield convulsed. The broken pyramids and terraces began to collapse inward, swirling toward the center like water down a drain. From the chasm below rose the Tomb of Kings, a massive structure that seemed to contain every grave that had ever existed. Its door yawned open, light spilling forth, light that was not divine, but hungry. "You cannot kill me, my son," said the Death Lord, stepping toward the abyss. "For I am the sum of all who have ruled, and their will is mine." He extended a hand. The very air around Akhmen-hotep began to twist and burn, the pull of the tomb dragging at his soul, trying to unravel it thread by thread. His essence began to fracture, memories spilling from him like sand through an hourglass. But even as he faltered, he smiled. "Then let me show you what your heir has learned." He drove his khopesh into his own chest. The weapon sank to the hilt, glowing with divine fire. The energy that spilled from the wound was not pain, but power. His body began to dissolve into light, his soul unbound, free to move as thought alone. He stepped forward, not walking, but becoming motion. His form blurred, multiplied, became 1,000 shadows, each one struck from a different angle, each blow landing as though time itself obeyed his command. Sutekh-Ramun reeled, his massive form staggering beneath the storm of strikes. His armor shattered, his molten veins spilling across the void like rivers of starfire, yet still he stood, defiant even as the light of his son's rebellion burned through him. Father and son locked eyes, one hollow and ancient, the other blazing with new eternity. "You are me," Sutekh-Ramun said. "You cannot deny your blood." "Then let that blood end with me," Akhmen-hotep answered. He thrust his blade forward, piercing his father's heart. For a moment, everything was silent. The watching ghosts fell to their knees. The pyramid stilled. The rivers of gold froze mid-flow. Then, with a sound like mountains breaking, the Death Lord screamed. His body split apart, light pouring from every wound, his crown shattering into fragments that shot across the void like meteors. The black flame of his spirit flared once, twice, and then collapsed inward, devoured by the very tomb he had summoned. The gates of the Tomb of Kings slammed shut with a thunderous finality. The void went dark. Akhmen-hotep fell to one knee, the khopesh dissolving in his hands, his body flickering between light and shadow. The scroll of Shay's doom appeared before him once more, its glyphs calm now, no longer writhing in rebellion. He had done the impossible. He had slain the father who could not die. And yet in that victory he felt no triumph, only emptiness. The realm of echoes trembled around him. The ghosts of the ancient kings bowed their heads, their whispers rising in a chorus that sounded like mourning. Mourning. The crown passes, the throne stands. Akhmen-hotep rose, his form wavering, his edges fading into dust. The veil between life and death had thinned to nothing, and now it claimed him too. But before the darkness took him, he looked toward where his father had fallen and whispered, "You're right. We are the same, but one of us must end the cycle." The void closed, swallowing them both. And far above, in the mortal world, the sands of Nehekhara stilled for the first time in an age. The storms ceased. The winds went quiet. Only the ruins of Ka-Sekhet remained, silent, sunken, and eternal. And from deep within its buried heart, the faintest echo rose, neither a scream nor a prayer, but something between the two. The laughter of a king who had won everything and lost himself in the victory. Chapter 14. The Scales of Java. The sky had turned the color of dying embers. Above the wastelands of Nehekhara, more sleep hung low and heavy, a festering eye that glared upon the ruin of the world below. Its baleful light turned the sands into rivers of green fire, shadows flowing like ink in reverse. The horizon itself trembled, caught between two realities, the mortal realm and the afterlife, where the veil had thinned to the point of tearing. At the center of it all lay Ka-Sekhet, once the jewel of the Tomb Kings, now nothing more than a corpse city drowning beneath the weight of eternity. The towers that had once kissed the heavens leaned like broken spears, their black gold facades peeling under the touch of necrotic wind. The obsidian spire, the heart of Akhmen-hotep's empire, was cracked from base to crown, its top half suspended in the air as if held there by sheer memory. The battle beyond death had ended, but not in victory. Within the heart of what remained, the Hall of Eternal Judgment, a chamber older than the first dynasty, Akhmen-hotep stood before the shattered remains of his father's spirit. The void fire had faded, leaving only the faint shimmer of Sutekh-Ramun's soul, now diminished to a wisp of blue flame flickering within the dust. It drifted before him, defiant even in ruin. The voice that once thundered across the desert now rasped like wind through bone. "You think this is victory, boy," the specter whispered, its edges fraying in the gloom. "You think death can cage me? You have only become me." Akhmen-hotep said nothing. His armor was cracked and blackened, the sigils of his crown dimmed, the fires within his eyes reduced to faint coals. The scroll of Shai's doom hovered beside him, its glyphs burning faintly, whispering words that only he could hear. He had won, yet there was no triumph, only the heavy stillness that follows when gods turn away. He could feel it, the land dying beneath his feet, the winds that once carried his name now murmured only in lament. The dead no longer marched. The magic that had bound his armies, his city, his soul, it was unraveling, thread by thread. This was the price of victory, and the realm could no longer hold them both, father and son, two halves of the same sin. The curse would not rest until the cycle was broken, utterly and completely. The scroll spoke again, its voice like the rustle of dry leaves in a tomb. "There is one final balance. The scales of Jaf await the souls of kings." Akhmen-hotep turned his gaze upward. Above the ruins of Ka-Sekhet, reality split. The heavens tore open like parchment under a blade, revealing a chasm of light and shadow. Through it the Hall of Judgment emerged, a vast, celestial plain that mirrored the court of the gods. Its floor was made of pure glass, reflecting every sin ever committed. Its pillars were formed of starlight bound in chains, and at its center stood the scales of Jaf. And they were vast enough to blot out the moon, two plates of burnished gold suspended by chains woven from the souls of the penitent. Upon one rested the feather of truth, glowing faintly white. Upon the other, the accumulated sins of 1,000 lifetimes, writhing, whispering, heavy as the cosmos. Akhmen-hotep felt the pull of it, the call of divine reckoning. It resonated within his hollow chest like the tolling of a final bell. He knew what it meant. The gods had come to weigh him. But he would not submit. "You would have me kneel," he murmured to the unseen heavens, his voice rough but resolute. "You would measure me against your laws when your gaze has never turned toward our suffering. You abandoned us to dust and hunger. I will not be judged by you." Scales trembled. The very air seemed to recoil at his defiance. From the void above, faint silhouettes appeared, the judges of the dead, the 42 spirits of judgment who served Jaf, god of death and balance. Cloaked in shadow and starlight, their faceless visages turned toward him in unison. Every king must kneel before the scales. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once, neither male nor female, mortal nor divine. It was Jah himself, the eternal judge, whose domain stretched from the first burial mound to the last crumbling tomb. "Your crimes are endless," the god intoned. "You betrayed your father, defiled your blood, consumed the souls of the faithful, and made war upon the dead themselves. Speak your defense, Akhmen-hotep of Ka-Sekhet, before the feather of truth weighs your eternity." The broken pharaoh lifted his head. His gaze was steady, unrepentant. "I have sinned," he said, "but I have done no evil." A ripple passed through the hall. as though even the gods hesitated. "Explain." He stepped forward, his voice gathering strength, echoing across the cosmic chamber. "I was born beneath a tyrant who called himself eternal. I watched our people toil under the illusion of divine rule while the gods slept. I saw the greatness of Nehekhara buried beneath obedience. I sought not to destroy the order, but to replace it with one that would not crumble with the turning of the stars. My father would have kept us chained. I broke those chains. Call it blasphemy, call it rebellion, but it was the only truth left to us." The feather of truth glowed brighter, as if testing the weight of his words. Sutekh-Ramun's soul flame flickered nearby, guttering like a dying candle. "Lies," the spectre hissed. "He speaks of freedom, yet all he sought was dominion. He raised his brother upon the altar. He drank the souls of his own blood. He would devour even you, Jaff, if it meant wearing your crown." The scales began to shift. The plate of sin groaned under invisible weight. Franklin's neck was bent before the inevitable. Akhmen-hotep turned, glaring at the ghost of his father. "And what of you? You who enslaved generations in death, who called yourself God while your people starved beneath your monuments. You ruled for eternity and learned nothing from it. I only became your reflection because you left me no choice." Recalled, the air split with thunder. The scales trembled violently. The judges of the dead raised their hands as the two souls' accusations tore through the fabric of judgment itself. Joff's voice returned, low and cold. "There is no justice between monsters. There is only balance." The feather of truth lifted from its plate, hovering in the air between father and son. Its glow intensified, becoming blinding. Then, "Balance us," Akhmen-hotep said. "Let neither of us rule nor rest. Let our sins weigh the same. Let our names fade from the stones of the world." The feather pulsed once, twice, and descended upon the scale of sin. The chamber erupted in light. A roar tore through the heavens, as if the universe itself cried out in protest. The scales tipped, not toward purity nor damnation, but into equilibrium, a perfect, motionless balance. The feather turned black. "So be it," Jaff whispered. "Judgment denied. Eternity unmade." The scales shattered. The explosion was silent but absolute. The hall of judgment crumbled into dust, and the gods turned their faces away, unable or unwilling to witness the annihilation of two of their own. Below, Ka-Sekhet convulsed. The ground split open in vast yawning chasms. The obsidian spire imploded, its foundations sinking into the desert. The necropolis, the temples, the grand statues, all fell into the sand, consumed by the same void that devoured their king. The Black Legions dissolved into dust. The Ushabti froze mid-battle, their massive frames collapsing into heaps of stone. The sacred fires guttered and died. And in the midst of the chaos, the forms of Akhmen-hotep and Sutekh-Ramun disintegrated into twin storms of ash and light, spiraling upward into the rift in the sky. Their voices mingled one last time, no longer words, but a single sound, something between a scream and a sigh. Then the rift sealed. Silence fell over Nehekhara. The sands settled. The gods did not speak. The priests did not dream. Only the desert remained, endless and cold, whispering of a city lost beneath its surface, a city that had once challenged death itself, and fallen not for sin, but for pride. And as the last grains of Ka-Sekhet vanished beneath the dunes, the wind carried a final murmur across the endless waste, neither blessing nor curse, but truth. O kings fall, even those who would defy the gods. Chapter 15. The Tomb That Screams. Centuries passed. Empires rose and crumbled into silence. Kings who claimed divinity were reduced to names etched into half-broken stone. The dunes of Nehekhara swallowed all, villages, roads, monuments, and memories. But not Ka-Sekhet. For though the city had been buried beneath the fury of gods and time, it had not died. It could not. The locals called it by another name now. A name never written, only whispered around fires when the stars hid behind sandstorms, and morosely bulged in the sky like a swollen wound. The throne of dust in vengeance. No map marked its location. It drifted like a ghost beneath the dunes, rising and falling with the pulse of something not quite alive. Caravan routes twisted away from the region instinctively, even when logic and direction demanded otherwise. Camels refused to step too close. Hawks turned from its air. And at night, when the wind grew still and the moon bled green above the desert, the silence broke. The screams began. They were not cries of terror or pain, but of fury, raw, endless, unyielding. The wind carried them across leagues of sand, warping them into voices too distant to comprehend, but too close to ignore. Some said it was just the howling of the wind through the canyons. Others claimed it was the breath of an ancient god, still mourning his broken throne. But the desert folk knew better. They said that beneath the dunes of the forgotten city, two kings still fought. Not with blades, for no weapon could pierce what they had become. Not with armies, for their legions had long turned to dust, but with their souls, their hatred forged into something eternal. Akhmen-hotep, the broken pharaoh, once a man, now a curse, and his father, Sutekh-Ramun, the Death Lord, bound forever in the spiral of rebellion and judgment. Their struggle had become legend, but not the kind that inspired songs or ballads, the kind that whispered in the marrow, that twisted the dreams of those who came too close. Nomads who wandered near the region returned changed, if they returned at all. Their skin pale as chalk, their eyes wide and hollow. Some screamed until their throats tore. Others fell into endless silence, clutching fistfuls of sand and murmuring names in forgotten tongues. The elders said these were marked, touched by the breath of the buried kings. The tomb screams, they would say. It screams because it cannot sleep. Beneath the sands, far deeper than any shovel could reach, the ruins of Ka-Sekhet still stood. Time had not worn them away. The stones had not crumbled. Instead, they pulsed with a terrible vitality, as if the city itself breathed through the sands. In its lowest chamber, what had once been the hall of eternal judgment, the air shimmered with ghostlight. Two shadows circled each other in endless spirals of memory and malice. They had no bodies anymore. They had no words. They were raged. They were vengeance. Locked in eternal conflict, their very existence had become a wound upon the world. The energy of their feud seeped upward through the soil, into the bones of the earth. The sand over Ka-Sekhet was never still. It whispered, it moved in spirals. It wept the echoes of war. And though no priest dared to utter their names, though no scroll preserved their history, they endured, not as rulers, not as gods, but as a curse carved into the soul of Nehekhara. Sometimes, when the stars aligned and the desert stood deathly quiet, those brave, or foolish, enough to listen closely could make out words in the scream. One voice rasped, "You took everything from me." And the other, "Then take what's left." Then came the silence again, heavy, watchful, eternal, and the wind moved on, carrying with it the dust of two kings who refused to fall, even when the gods themselves had turned their backs. The throne of dust and vengeance did not mourn. It remembered, and it would scream until the end of all things.